done my hair, to be honest, if I'd known.
So would I.
Sorry, I've gone for low maintenance in lockdown.
I went for a walk with the wife this morning. We saw somebody with their dreadlocks down to the middle of their back. But I'm getting that way. I'm getting quite
Let me just turn my phone off.
Anyway, shall we get on?
Just going to turn my phone off so we don't get interrupted. Do we have 40 minutes on this?
Yeah, yeah. It always seems about the right sort of length of time for one of these as well.
Yeah, it's certainly the right amount of time to speak to my father-in-law. We do a lot of those for him. So,
another feeling. Well, I suppose as the guy who started the thing going, I ought to. Well, no such thing as a chair in something like this, but if I say what started me on the track, and then I know Hillary's got far more knowledge about this.
Yeah.
Tim probably has as well, because I'm an ex-computer engineer and I know bugger all about the environment effectively, except what I can see. What started me going on this was the fact that I can understand the problem of nutrification. What I can't understand, I understand the problem of nutrification in the Solent area.
Yeah.
Not about anywhere else. What I can't understand is how putting a farm on the Isle of Wight is going to help the Solent area.
No, that's fine.
Can you explain that one?
Yes, of course I can. Yeah, no, absolutely. So, you know, we came into this, you know, we were aware of the Dutch nitrate case, which is the legal underpinning to this restriction back in, well, probably when it was announced or became a substantive planning matter, probably January last year, I think around that sort of time, probably a little before that even. Yeah. We'd sort of assumed that there'd be a resolution of it because obviously politically holding up planning applications is not politically very popular. But when it wasn't, we started looking at this more seriously last autumn. So what the basis of our scheme is based on the Environment Agency modelling, which is the basis of Natural England's advice. And I'm sure you've seen their advice note, it runs through about 50 odd pages. And that breaks it up into catchments based on modelling done by the Environment Agency that talks about how sediments and nutrients move around the Solent. Well, when we came into this back in the autumn, the initial advice by Natural England was if you reduce nutrients going into the Solent almost anywhere in the Solent, that will be acceptable because it would reduce the net nutrient inputs. Now, they've refined that advice in the interim, because it seems there are sort of subsystems within the larger Solent system. And so the East Solent effectively system is influenced by inputs from the coast. So, you know, the Peel Common Buds Farm discharge point, but also discharges from agriculture in those rivers that discharge into the East Solent, but also rivers that discharge into the East Solent from the north coast of the Isle of Wight. So the selection of our site there is because it sits on the Wootton Creek, and the Wootton Creek discharges into that system. So a reduction of nitrates that run into the Wootton reduce nitrates into the East Solent system. So that can work as a, because that system is relatively self-contained, so that can work as an offset for Peel Common and Buds Farm discharges. So it's not just a random farm without a water body that discharges. So that's the basis of our assumptions about Duxmoor discharging and reducing nitrates into the Solent there.
But it's not going to make any difference to that. That's the problem. And the problem surely for that is what is coming from the mainland. Okay, I accept.
Well, interesting actually. The inputs for that, and you're right, that is a serious issue. Obviously, the Wildlife Trust is about trying to make sure that SPAs, the modelling shows that actually discharges from the wastewater treatment plants actually contribute some, but not all. They don't sort of discharge straight into that. So they actually go into the larger East Solent system and contribute to that. But if you reduce it into that system, that will have the net offset that is legally required. Now, would I like to see a massive wholesale reduction of nitrates and eutrophication in the Solent? Absolutely. Absolutely want to see that. And you'd have to tackle a whole range of inputs from agriculture, from wastewater treatment, but just a massive range of inputs. So long term, would we want to see that absolutely reduced? You're completely right, but that's going to be a huge project over a long period of time, because a lot of those nitrates are stored and are slow releasing from the soils and things like that over time. But the legal test is that, as you sort of referred to, is that we're not causing, or development is not causing a sort of piecemeal increase in the problem. And that's what we're trying to do, is obviously address the increase, so make sure there's no net increase, but also try and slightly improve on that. Obviously, the idea that there's a sort of buffer, but also we're doing stuff that will probably result in an even lower discharge from our land than the 5 kgs they model. So that's the intention of our approach. Now, I appreciate one of the frustrations with people I speak to is we're doing biodiversity stuff, but not where the biodiversity loss is in your local area. So I just want to say at the outset that, we absolutely recognise the number of houses, the planning system really is not fit for purpose at the moment. We've got no strategic planning, so local authorities are having enormous housing numbers placed on them, which they can't fit in and accommodate biodiversity in community and schools and hospitals, which is, I don't know why, but Fareham seems to be particularly acutely affected by that. That's sort of central government policy not to have strategic planning. I live in the New Forest district are in exactly the same situation. I don't think they can fit the housing in without damaging the forest. But we made that case at the EIP, completely ignored. We felt we won the argument, completely ignored. So, don't get me wrong, I'm not here defending the planning system. The planning system is not working to protect the most valuable things. This scheme is really about addressing nitrates and trying to, rewild and return the breakdown of biodiversity. But the legal driver is nothing to do with biodiversity, unfortunately. It's just what we want to do.
Can I just ask one last question, and then I'll pass it over? How much do you reckon the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust is going to make from selling the nitrate credits?
Well, the way we work,
what it's about.
Yeah, no. The way we work it out is pretty straightforward. We work out the cost of the farm, the cost of the land we're securing. I then have a formula that I work out what it will cost for the trust to manage that land in perpetuity, which with Fareham is 125 years, but it ranges between 80 and 125 years. So we then work out how much it will cost for us to discharge our responsibilities to manage that farm for that period of time. Not really going to be my problem. I do this for a whole range of things. I work that out, and that's a whole range of things like fencing, staffing, all the other things you have to do to maintain land, trees falling over, tracks, whatever. I work that out. I then work out how much that costs a year, and I capitalise that. And then I work out how many kgs of offset are on the site, and that drives the price. So in many ways, we don't make anything. We just make the money that covers the cost of running the scheme, managing the site in perpetuity and securing it. We're not really in it for, there are other schemes out there, as you're probably aware. There's the Warnford Estate scheme, which has I think it's fair to say, a more commercial model. But our scheme is really more about ensuring we have the funds to discharge our duties for the period of the contract.
Okay, thank you. Over to somebody else. Who's going to pick it up now?
Can I come in at this point? Is that okay? Thanks for that explanation there. That was really helpful. So thanks to John for that. What I'd like to ask is, on the back of that explanation, I'd like to ask the question about, I read that when you start to rewild the farm, that you're going to continue to graze cattle and pigs. Now,
no pigs.
No pigs.
No pigs.
Just cattle, okay. So cattle produce nitrates. So although you're saying you're going to be taking the farm out of agriculture, it sounds as though not all of the farm would be taken out. Is that right?
No, I'm quite happy to address that. So we're not saying we're taking out of agriculture. What we're doing is a form of agriculture that's a zero inputs agriculture. And it's a good question about livestock, and this sometimes is, there's some confusions about livestock. So when you put livestock on a farm, as long as you don't supplementary feed those animals, so you don't bring any external food in for the animals, so as long as your grazing density is very low, and our grazing density is very low indeed, the animals just consume the forage that grows naturally on the land. They use that forage to put on biomass, and obviously then the waste, as it were, falls out the back end. But because we're not supplementary feeding, we're putting no additional feed in, so the animals get no food apart from that they eat from the land, they can't add nitrates. It's impossible, because they take some nitrogen out, some nitrates out to put on biomass, heat, to breed. So all of that nitrates that they are consuming, you know, a percentage of it is in the body mass, and a percentage falls out the back. But the net nitrogen must be less than they consume, because there is no additional nitrogen coming in. And because we make it a very, very low density, they don't need that supplementary feeding. If they did, we just take them off. So it's a super low, extensive type of management, which won't result in any additional nitrogen. And it's important that, because as you say, if it was a commercial sort of farm or a dairy farm where they're feeding a lot of concentrate to their animals, they would be bringing nitrates onto the site, which would be falling out the back of the animal, with all due respect, and adding to the burden. So it's really important that actually that it's not that type of intensive agriculture. We're talking a very extensive sort of system.
Sure. And in terms of the time lag, which you've already mentioned, we understand that it can take decades for the nitrates that are being produced at the moment to permeate their way through to the seas and the rivers and so on. At that point, surely you're going to be adding to the nitrates, because the developers they won't be waiting decades. They'll be, you know, straight onto it. They'll be putting the developments up, but at the same time, we've still got the nitrates permeating through to the sea.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The decade, the long-term addition is really for farms that are high on the chalk or whatever, that don't have a direct link to the sea. So right there is, if your development is occupied, and it's about the wastewater coming out of the occupants, not the building of it. So it's when occupancy takes place, and that's the sort of test. So when your development becomes occupied, it is producing additional nitrates. What we've got is a farm that has a direct link to the Solent through a stream that runs into a larger stream that runs into the Wootton Brook, which runs into the Solent. The time lag between putting nitrates on that land and it getting into the Solent is very short, because they would wash directly into that river. So what we're doing is immediately taking that land out of production. So it immediately comes out of production. So the additional nitrates that would have been applied for the intensive land use that it was under are immediately withdrawn from the system. So the benefit is accrued immediately, and continues to be accrued by the fact that we continually keep it out of production. So even if, you know, in 5 years' time, the development is occupied, we've already compensated for that impact by removing that land from production. So you're right, if we bought a farm on the high chalk with no obvious link to the Solent, it can take a long time for anything that would be added to that land to permeate through to the groundwater and in. And so the delay might be 20 years or 10 years for that, and the impact could be in 3 years. So that wouldn't be acceptable, because the impact on the Solent is within 3 years, the mitigation arrives late, and the legal test is that the mitigation must be in place before the impact accrues.
Yeah.
And our mitigation is going to be in place immediately, and the impact will accrue over the next, 80, 100 years or whatever. Okay.
So you mentioned that the East Solent and the Wootton feeds into the Solent. What I would like to know is, in terms of the catchment area, are you confirming then that the catchment area is the same from Wootton as it is where the EU designated sites are within the Solent?
Yeah, that's the information that the Environment Agency has provided. That's the most up-to-date science that Natural England have used to divide their catchment. So their catchment model of, you know, I don't know if you've seen the coloured map with different catchments in.
Yeah,
so yeah, the information we have is that, yeah, you probably got it, is that the Wootton Brook discharges into that East Solent catchment. So for the mitigation for the Solent, it is within that same catchment, yes.
Okay, good, thank you. One last question, and I'll give Tim a chance. You've spoken about, you know, you've got clear ideas about the timing, about the amount, about how quickly you can take this land from production and so on. You must have calculated something so that the developers know what they can purchase, what their credits will how that fits into the calculation, the nitrogen budget. Is that something that you hold, that calculation?
We don't do the developer's calculation. That's down to them to do. So any development has to work its own calculation out, you know, or we'd be sort of playing both ends against the middle. We don't do that. So any developer approaches us, we say, you need to work out what your impact is, and you need to come to an agreement with the local planning authority in Natural England about that. We will then see if we have capacity on the site. So the site capacity is about 963 kgs. And we will see how much capacity we have within the site for you. And once we run out, we can't obviously resell. So we sell the mitigation offset up to that capacity, and then the site's done. And the way we make sure we aren't doing that is obviously we have a spreadsheet that will monitor that all the time. So we will offset exact amounts against the land surface area that's available, and we will actually, for the local planning authority, produce a map that shows where each development is being mitigated for within that site.
Okay. So the calculations that the trust has done, I sent an online request to have sight of that, but I haven't had a reply. I've had a sort of a standard, we'll get back to you kind of reply, but nobody's actually responded to me on that. Is that something?
I haven't seen that, I'm afraid. So, yeah, I mean, our office isn't really manned at the moment because of a variety of reasons. So, really, if that comes to me, then that sort of comes to me, really, and that's probably the best way of doing it. So, yeah, the way we've worked is using Natural England standard methodology, the historic land use. So we've got areas of poultry which has a standard methodology. So we've simply used Natural England's published methodology for working that out. So you can just have a look at that in the Natural England published data. So we've deliberately not chosen to open up their methodology. That's the published one. They've used, you know, we're presuming the best science available and the most up-to-date science available, and that's the test that you know, we think should be applied, that they use the best science. So we followed that science. We didn't think there's a lot of mileage in freestyling it, if I'm honest.
I'm sure you're already aware, but we have taken council's advice, QC advice, and the opinion is that the Natural England advice is they're interpreting the habitats regulations incorrectly, because the LPA is applying that advice, and it sounds as though you are as well. Then you, of course, would be complicit in working unlawfully. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've seen that QC's advice. I must admit, over the years, I've seen an awful lot of QC's advice. And the way English law works, obviously, is it's based on case law. And, you know, I've seen a lot of QC's advice around HABs regs in particular that opposes each other. That's what QC's are paid to do, really, is to write, is to give advice. But you know, that's an opinion of a QC. That's not law. That's an opinion of a QC. You know, the way that I've been working with the HABs regs for 23 years, really, that they aren't entirely clear. There is some pretty strong principles in there. This beyond reasonable scientific doubt. The fact that mitigation has to be in place prior to impacts. As far as we can see, Natural England are using the best scientific advice and data available. We can secure the land in perpetuity, so that provides a certainty, and it's in place in advance of impact. You know, ultimately, the test of whether Natural England's advice is lawful or not isn't one we could possibly apply. Our view is that on balance it looks sound, but we're not able to and analyze all the data they've used to produce that information. You know, that's clearly not something we could possibly do. And ultimately, you know, the local planning authorities are really in the same position. You know, they have to take Natural England's advice. There's some case law around the ferries at Lymington that basically suggested that local planning authorities and Section 28G organisations need to take Natural England's advice as sort of the primary source of advice when coming to their decisions. So, you know, I do understand, you know, that your QC has concerns. You know, as I said, I see a lot of QC's advice over the years, and they bounce back and forth between each other as they argue away. Really, you know, it's a good way to spend a lot of money.
Sorry,
I don't think we would be viewed to be acting unlawfully at all, because we're not a statutory body here. So we are following the best advice available to us. So I think whether the planning authority is deemed to be issuing planning permissions unlawfully is a slightly different matter, but it certainly isn't unlawful for the trust to offer an option.
So just to make you aware, you probably are aware anyway, the QC isn't just any old QC. This is the top planning QC in the country, highly respected. Everybody knows him. The LPA were aware of him before we presented our QC's opinion. And the interesting thing is we are working with Natural England because of all the holes in their advice, and because we've told them that we consider that they potentially are acting unlawfully by giving that advice. I've been at many of the push meetings where they and the Environment Agency don't see eye to eye on this, which doesn't help matters. So yeah, okay.
No, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not questioning the approach your QC is suggesting. He's championing a precautionary principle which underpins the HABS regs. Yeah. Just like to say that, you know, looking at that advice from what I've seen online, there's a question mark around some of Natural England's calculations. The way that would impact, that wouldn't really impact on our scheme. All it would do was mean that the developers had to purchase a higher level, more nitrate offsets. If you understand how the scheme works, you know, they would come to us and say, actually, there's been a challenge. It's actually 150 litres a day, not 110. The impact is higher. So actually, we've recalculated our kg offset requirement. So instead of 10, it's 15. So they would have to buy 15 instead of 10. That actually doesn't change the fundamentals of the way our scheme works. It just changes the fundamentals of what a developer would have to purchase or secure in any other way to offset. You know, and yeah. I think the frustration, obviously, for these type of things is that ultimately there are solutions. You know, there's obviously the Warneford Estate solution. There's a number of wetland solutions. So, you know, there will be solutions to this. They will find a way to offset at the time.
And certainly as residents, all we want is for them to adhere to the Habitats Directive, and which is not about being nitrate neutral. It's about reducing the nitrates and making it an improved situation. So that's what we want. And once that happens, we talked about this earlier, the three of us, you know, that's what we want. We are concerned that the Natural England advice is causing there are some parts of the process in the developer side and the LPA side which are flawed, and as a result planning applications will be coming through the system, and we will be making that situation in Solent worse and not protecting those EU designated sites, therefore acting unlawfully. And I would say it'd be an interesting debate actually as to whether the trust, who is part of that equation, would still be acting unlawfully or not, but that's for another day.
Well, I'm pretty confident we're not, but because okay. we are simply selling a amount of nitrate offset. The flaw, if there is one, is in the calculation of the requirement of the offset. Now, I completely agree that all our Natura 2000 sites should be managed to favourable condition. So, you know, part of the problems are these historic, you know, basically there's been historic management of our floodplain grasslands that have allowed excessive amounts of nitrates to get into the Solent, and arguably our wastewater treatment plants haven't done a good job either. So, you know, you're right. Whether it's the new forest and recreational pressure, the Solent coast and recreational pressure, or the Solent and the blanket weed nitrates issue, all of these issues, we should not be settling for a situation where, you know, poor condition, unfavourable condition is acceptable. Absolutely right. You know, everybody involved should be fighting to see a position where we are moving to at least unfavourable recovering or favourable conditions. So, you know, no argument there. You're absolutely right. You know,
it's driving to this
argument about. I think it's a technical argument about whether Naturaling's advice is leading to that or not, and you know, that technical argument is really around the science that underpins their advice, I think.
Yeah, I actually have spoken to Natural England on many occasions and in communication with them regularly, and I've actually praised them for what they've had to do in a short space of time, because they have tried, you know, really tried, and they've taken on board some of our appeal cases, some of the advice we've given them, fed back to them. They are trying to improve that advice, but as it stands at the moment, we feel that it's not up to the mark. Can I ask, sorry, I'm sort of hogged the conversation there, so I don't know if Tim wants to come in with something. John?
My question might be slightly more technical. No, it's technical. John, at the moment, Duxmoor Farm, according to your website, is set to offset 400 dwellings, supposedly, worth approximately. I suppose just I've been looking at various bits of documentation, but Push, I think, reported in October that they felt that over the Push area, there was something like a deficit of 4,500 dwellings. What's the scope of this project? Because that seems like a hell of a lot of dwellings. I mean, ultimately, I think your director was talking about 12,000 houses. That's 3,000 acres of land. Where the hell is that going to come from?
Well, bizarrely enough, because the agricultural sector is under huge pressure, and particularly land on the Isle of Wight, agriculture on the Isle of Wight and arable on the Isle of Wight is under massive pressure because, you know, farming is difficult. Arable farming is economically difficult at the best of times. Transporting produce across the Solent is expensive, and the grain handling facility at Southampton Docks has just disappeared. You know, the viability of some farming operations is very, very marginal. And if you add the loss of basic payment scheme after we move the EU into the equation, we have been offered a surprisingly large amount of land, actually. Now, the scope is, you know, it depends. I think there are a number of potential wetland creation schemes that are coming on that may prove cheaper for developers to buy into than we can offer. So there are a number of options coming through that aren't really strictly dependent on us. That sort of 400 house thing is not a scientific thing. It's an attempt to calculate with the average bit of offset. It's more about, we think it's probably in the region of that. It may be more, it may be less. You know as well as I do, it depends on how much the developer can persuade Natural England they are offsetting on site, and then you know there's a residue that needs to be dealt with, which is what our scheme will end up doing. So the number of houses is a bit difficult. If we look at, you know, more up-to-date wastewater treatment plants like Pennington, the average per house is, I think, only about 1 kilo. But when you get into some of the older ones that aren't really up-to-date, they seem to be closer to 2.5 to 3 kg. So it does depend.
So okay, on a slightly different tack, you said about the outflow into Wootton Creek, or with, I forgot my name, Wootton Creek. That there is, in effect, by taking Duxmoor Farm out of use, there is an immediate benefit, but presumably it will over time continue still to leach nitrates. There is a point, presumably, and these we're talking about inorganic nitrates, presumably. Organic nitrates are slightly less of a problem, although obviously they are a factor. Presumably, though, over time, there will continue to be an outflow. Over the period of the time that there is an outflow, obviously, you can offset against that. but isn't there a point at which you reach almost stasis where there is no net marginal outflow? Is that within the 80 years, or at which point, presumably, you can't then offset against it because it's not a net outflow?
That's not, yeah, it's an interesting point. Actually, it's not quite the way Natural England view it. Oh, there is a residual outflow that they suggest is 5 kg a hectare that just continues to come. So we drop that. You've seen the calculation. We drop that off.
Yeah.
The calculation is based really on the fact that if the land remained in intensive agriculture, it would be having the relevant kgs per of nitrogen placed on the land for the whole period. So rather than, if we impoverish this land, which is, the trust model is always low nutrients. So what we want is low nutrient land. So we won't be having any nitrates. So the model that Natural England apply is they're assuming the land stays in intensive arable. If it stays in intensive arable, every year nitrates is added. So if the trust remove it from intensive arable, no nitrates is added. So that is the net offset, is the difference between our type of management and what the management would have been if it remained in that farming system.
Okay. In a way, though, what you've said kind of speaks to the inexactitude of the whole thing. It's a lot of this, and this is not actually really a trust matter, but this is the fact that Natural England and their calculations seem to be quite inexact, and there seems to be a lot of wriggle room. Just reading about the various areas, the Ramsar areas or whatever, and the areas around not only the East Solent but elsewhere. There seem to be large gaps in the knowledge of the levels of eutrophication. A lot of the advice speaks of work in progress on areas around Langstone Harbour and other bits of Portsmouth and Southampton water, where we just don't know what the level is that we're offsetting.
I think that's not an unfair sort of characterisation. I think in many ways the work is progressing. The Environment Agency are redoing their work at the moment. They're recalculating some stuff, and they are looking to publish that, I hope, shortly. I think the sort of test, I suppose, is Natural England using the best evidence available to it? And they assure me they are. Now,
their documents are full of caveats saying exactly that, the best we possibly can at the moment. But I suppose part of what I'm driving at is, on the one hand, we've got this model that says, well, there's a whole lot we don't know. On the other hand, we're trying to be scientific with the developers and say, you're tied down to X, Y, and Z. The other thing that slightly nags in my mind is, how do you hold the developers to what they've said they're going to do in the plans? That presumably isn't a trust thing, but that someone's got to say, hang on a second, you said in your plans you would have X amount of usage. You're not doing that. You're doing something completely different.
Yes, I suppose. The thing is with the developers is that their plans, they're not, unless they're using a on-site offset that they're controlling. But if they're effectively saying we're going to mitigate offset on somebody else's scheme, it's us who's delivering the mitigation for that. So provided they deliver the development to their planning application, which would presumably have a number of sort of water reduction measures or whatever, as long as the way they've calculated it, they're delivering that through the planning system, then I think that probably is less of a concern. But I understand what you're saying. I think in defence of Natural England, sorry.
We have just over 3 minutes left.
I've got 3. Sorry, I'm homeschooling and home feeding, so I've just been.
That's all right. We've got 3 minutes left, and then you can get back.
My direct line manager's just appeared and asked where our lunch is. So I just want to say, in defence of Natural England, they've become under enormous political pressure to row back on this and just say there's no problem at all. Just plough on, because the idea of and it is Natural England have shown considerably more. How can I put this politely? But a lot of backbone in standing up here. Now I appreciate there is an argument, and I understand where you're coming from. Is the scientific data rigorous enough? And that's a question to ask. That's quite a perfectly valid question to ask. But I think the fact that Natural England, under enormous pressure from everything from central government down, have held their ground and stood their ground and said, we believe this is an issue that needs to be mitigated, is really surprising for me, because, you know, I've spent the last 25 years flagging issues up that we think are significant problems for SPAs and SACs, and seen mitigation measures that have not, in my view, been rigorous enough. So, you know, I'm surprised and quite impressed that they've actually stood their ground and sort of held this as it. Because of course, you know, on the other side of the argument, there is the danger as well that if the Environment Agency's opinion held sway and the Environment Agency said it's not an issue, there is no issue, these aren't causing an issue, then the requirement to mitigate disappears. So, you know, if the science says developments are not causing a problem to the Solent, the problem for the Solent is the source of that problem is elsewhere, then there will be no need to mitigate at all legally. So, you know, Natural England.
Sorry, how close are you, John, to signing the legal agreement on this scheme?
Probably within a few weeks.
And who signs it?
From our point of view.
Well, both sides, really.
So it'll depend whether the chief exec, I would have thought, or our chairman of trustees probably will be the signatory. Probably our chief exec, I would have thought it would be delegated to her.
And is it with Ferrum or is it with Push?
I don't know who signs from Ferrum's point of view. I'm sorry, I don't know who would.
Right, so this is a Ferrum deal only. This is not including the rest of Push.
No, well, it potentially is. That the agreement basically, Ferrum have done the legwork on this legally, so they're the first body to be a party, but the terms of the agreement allow other local authorities to join the agreement if they so wish. So it's a tripartite agreement with us, Isle of Wight and Ferrum at the moment, but it could be a multi-partite agreement if Gosport, Havant, Portsmouth, whoever else wants to be part of it. So they could all become party to it.
And there won't be much mitigation in Ferrum if that little lot get involved with it either, will there?
Well, you know, there was always a temptation about local planning authorities, I think, to keep the mitigation solely for themselves, but that isn't actually their shout. But yeah, they would prefer to have as much capacity as possible. But you know, I mean, there are other interested parties.
Because the numbers coming out of this won't even cover one development in Ferrum, so it's peanuts.
We're scratching the surface of it.
One of the things I just want to say is that, you know, obviously the big developments are a big issue for you guys, you know, but there are a large number of 1 and 2 house, sort of really small scale